Every Remembrance Day, the people of Lancaster, like the people of every town across Britain and many other countries, fall silent to remember those who have died in war. Most of those whom we remember were the victims of not one, but two world wars. The conflict of the First World War has now passed out of living memory, but now, more than 70 years since the start of the most devastating war that humanity has ever experienced, some of this area's few remaining World War II veterans share their stories from a conflict which claimed the lives of over 60 million people. The Second World War bore many similarities to the first one, 2 decades previously. In fact, most of the war's participants were the children of the soldiers of the First World War.
My father, he was a prisoner of war in the First World War, and he was 19, I think, when he was a prisoner, and he was a prisoner for just over 12 months when the war finished.
He was a Lewis gunner. He was born in 1896, so he'd be 18 when war broke out. He was badly wounded at a place called La Boiselle on the 16th of June in July 1916. And he had this explosive bullet go through and he was badly wounded in his back.
My father was in the trenches and my mother was a nurse in Salonika, and she was invalided out in 1918 with typhus and malaria.
He was also in the First World War in the Royal Flying Corps, and not many years later, of course, I was called up and I finished up in the Fleet Air Arm, which is very much the same as where my father was.
The fighting ended in 1918 when the German Empire, exhausted after 4 years of war, signed an armistice with the Allied nations. Hostilities were formally ended with the signing of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, but the harsh treaty infuriated the German people. Many of them believed that the newly established Weimar Republic had betrayed them. Numerous political groups sought to capitalize on this newfound hatred for the government. One such faction was the Nazi Party. The Nazis advocated that the Weimar government had betrayed its own people. They also claimed that ethnic Germans were superior to all other human beings, and that consequently they had a right to rule over Europe. The party was led by Adolf Hitler, but it was not until after the Wall Street crash of 1929 that support for the Nazis began to grow. By 1933, Hitler had become Chancellor of Germany, and by 1935 he had replaced the Weimar government with an oppressive dictatorship. Yet the Nazis retained, and even increased, their popularity by restoring the collapsed German economy.
We criticised the Germans for allowing the Nazism to happen. But at the same time, because of the poor terms of the armistice, again it was the French, principally, who created it, because if they had peace on honourable terms, then I don't think that would have happened. But they left the Germans with a sense of anger and frustration, which I can well understand. I mean, it was an armistice, it wasn't a winning of the war by one side or the other. And therefore there should have been more generous terms. So that I can understand. I don't agree with it, but I can understand it.
The Nazi propaganda machine advocated hatred and prejudice against people whom they saw as inferior, especially the Jews. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws deprived all Jews in Germany of their basic civil rights. Anyone who opposed these policies was either imprisoned or executed. However, prejudice against minorities in society was not something confined solely to Nazi Germany.
There'd been conflict all through my life with the two sections of community at each other's throats. Even in, if you will, if I can explain to you, they never lived together.
Catholics and Protestants.
Catholics and Protestants didn't live together. I'm a Protestant, so I lived on one side of the Crumlin Road in North Belfast. The Catholics lived on the other side. Now I realise the stupidity of it all, but that was the way things were. Kids were brought up to hate the other side, and the other side were brought up to hate them. And this enmity has gone on for 100 years. And the result was the conflict that happened in the last 20, 30 years. It showed the futility to me since then of what's happening, you know, the hatred. It'll take generations for it to die off. Generations.
But events in Germany were of little interest to the average person in Britain, most of whom were focused on finding employment.
At my day and age, it's not like the modern youth. It was still the era of the haves and the have-nots. And I was one of those with the have-nots. So we didn't have much knowledge of these things.
I got my first job within a couple of weeks of leaving school.
What did you do?
I went into the weaving sheds. I was living in Shipley at that time, near Bradford in the West Riding of Yorkshire. And I went into the weaving sheds.
You see, when I was 14, and then from Burnley, we moved to Fleetwood. Instead of going back to the school for the last few months, went down on the docks with a few of the three more lads, and Mac Fisheries had bought 15 new trawlers from Germany, and they come along, they see us four, and this bloke come along, he said, "Do you want to go see, lads?" And we said yes. So we went, I went on one and the others went on the other three, deep sea fishing around Iceland, Norway and Greenland. And we did that for 4 years. And then we all met, and then we got fed up with that. And we said, well, what are we going to do? And then we tossed up the Army, Navy, Air Force and Merchant Navy. So we tossed up the Army one, so we all joined the Army. Went down to Forward Barracks in Preston and joined up, got the King's Shilling. And they give you a book of all the cap badges. And I picked up the White Horse of Kent, which is what I was in then, the Queen's Own Royal West Kent Regiment.
When I left school at 14, then I went to work at Story Brothers, you know, the tablecloths and stuff, as a manual worker. And then whilst I was in there, I joined the Territorials.
But whilst a small number of men in Britain were volunteering for the armed forces, in Germany many men were being conscripted into Hitler's new army. The Treaty of Versailles had banned conscription and limited the German army to 100,000 men, and prohibited the use of tanks and armed aircraft. Many Germans hated these restrictions, and Hitler exploited these feelings by promising to create a new, modern, and formidable German army. When he came to power in 1933, Hitler ordered the army to begin rearming in secret. In 1935, he openly violated the Versailles Treaty by reintroducing conscription, developing new tanks for the army, and establishing a new German air force. These actions brought Hitler new popularity, as he had reduced unemployment and made Germany strong again. But, despite these blatant violations of Versailles, Britain and France did nothing. Nearly 20 million people had died in the First World War, and the Allies were determined to avoid such devastating conflict again. But Germany was not the only country on the rise in the 1930s. The Soviet Union was also growing in strength. Stalin, the dictator of communist Russia, had been forcefully transforming the Soviet Union into a great industrial power, but only at the cost of millions of lives. This new economic power gave Russia greater strength, and some people began to see the Soviet Union as the main threat to Europe. Consequently, some Allied politicians reasoned that perhaps a re-strengthened Germany could act as a deterrent against potential Soviet expansionism. But in reality, it was Hitler, not Stalin, who presented the greatest threat.
I mean, he had to be stopped. He would have taken over the whole of the Western world anyway. I don't suppose he'd have got to America or the Pacific, but Hitler certainly was well on it. We were about the last one to go, apart from the neutral countries. But Stalin was a threat. He had to be stopped from taking over. I don't think people have got the right to take over a country that's not theirs. People have got the right to make their own destiny, that follow their own ways.
However, the Nazis had no respect for the independence of other countries, and were planning to create a greater German state that would encompass all people of German origin. In March 1938, Hitler made yet another blatant violation of Versailles by annexing Austria. But Britain and France still remained passive. After all, the Austrians were a German-speaking people, and Hitler had announced that he did not want any further territory. However, just months later, Hitler began demanding the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia. The Sudetenland was comprised mostly of ethnic Germans, but the Czechs refused to give it up without a fight, and war between Germany and Czechoslovakia seemed imminent. Now, the Allies could no longer ignore the situation. France had promised to defend Czechoslovakia, and Britain had an alliance with France, but both wanted to avoid war. In an attempt to resolve the situation, Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, flew to Munich in September 1938 to negotiate with Hitler. It was agreed that Germany could annex the Sudetenland, as long as they guaranteed not to invade the rest of Czechoslovakia. This outcome infuriated the Czechs, but they knew that without external support from Britain and France, they could never win a war against the Nazis. The British and French, however, were relieved, and Chamberlain was congratulated upon returning home.
I had another talk with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler. And here is the paper which bears his name upon it as well as mine. We regard the agreement signed last night and the Anglo-German naval agreement as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again.
But just 6 months later, Hitler violated the Munich Agreement and invaded Czechoslovakia. The Czechs knew that resistance was pointless now that Britain and France had abandoned them. Chamberlain has since been criticised for not taking a more aggressive stance against Hitler, but was appeasement really the wrong policy?
He probably did a very good thing, because at least it gave us a chance to build up the Air Force for another year. Because at that time, if Germany had launched their attack, at that time, it was bad enough as it was, but I think we could have lost the war.
He was a traitor. And of course, we must think of King Edward VIII. That my father always referred to him as the traitor king.
Well, I just think Chamberlain at that time, when he came back from Munich, he was conned. Because that piece of paper he had, it wasn't worth what it was written on, was it?
Well, his idea was good, but was it Mitchell, him that perfected Spitfire? He told Chamberlain that they was training a lot of glider pilots in Germany as to be engine pilots, you know, to have the engines in them. And they never did take no notice on him. You know. Now Chamberlain, he was trying to talk his way out of it.
I think Chamberlain was a bit of a softy myself, but I can't tell you what I thought about the agreement. It probably didn't interest the man in the street type of thing, if you follow what I mean.
Looking back, do you think he was wrong to appease Hitler?
I do, yes, yeah, I do. But there again, what can we do?
Yes, I knew that he, in effect, had bought us 12 months' time.
Did you think it was genuine peace he'd bought, or just a temporary respite from?
We all knew that it was a respite to give us time to rearm.
Do you think that was the right decision for him to make?
Yes. We would not have been prepared in 1938.
But appeasement had also convinced Hitler that the Allies were unwilling to go to war to stop him from taking over Eastern Europe. Less than 1 week after the invasion of Czechoslovakia, Hitler began demanding control of the Polish corridor. The Polish corridor had been taken away from Germany after the First World War, and Poland now refused to surrender it. At the end of March 1939, Chamberlain pledged to protect the Poles against a German invasion. But, with Hitler refusing to back down and Britain and France guaranteeing to protect Poland, it now seemed only a matter of time before war broke out. The people of Britain began making preparations for the upcoming conflict. Air raid shelters were built, blackout curtains were made, gas masks were issued.
I know it was coming, you know, there was all the talk and everything, but at that age you've got other things on your mind, it doesn't mean quite so much. I was very worried in one respect, because my father, in the First World War, had an explosive bullet that went in at one side and out of the other, and when we were issued with gas masks, of course there were gaps, and that worried me, because I thought, oh, the gas, well, you know, the gas mask didn't fit perfectly, the gas would get through there. That sort of thing bothered me more, I think.
By this time, Chamberlain's government had finally realised that nothing short of war would stop Hitler. In May 1939, they passed the Military Training Act to expand the army. At the same time, the Territorial Army was also being trained.
And I went to a place called Reedesdale in Northumberland, a firing camp. You know, and then just before war started, we went to a place called Trosvini in North Wales. You know, And we said, hey, there's a rumour there's going to be a war on, you know. I said, can't, Father. I said, we've just come back from a fortnight.
As I said, we were in the barracks at Maidstone. You're in there 3 months before you go out. You're learning how to walk, how to dress yourself, how to be just discipline. That's what you was taught, was discipline. And then from there I went to Shorncliffe to join the 1st Battalion of the West Kents. And I didn't do a lot of training there. You went on manoeuvres and all that, but no jungle training whatsoever. It was all house fighting and all that. Because, I mean, nobody knew the Japanese was fighting out there when, you know, it wasn't known. It was only Germany there was. And then I was at Shorncliffe. And then I got called in the office and I was told to report back to Maidstone, and I became a PT, physical training instructor.
But Hitler was not concerned by British preparations for war. He believed that the Allies would never honour their pledge of assistance to Poland. But what about Russia? Stalin might see an invasion of Poland as a threat to the security of the Soviet Union. Hitler did not want war with Russia. Not yet. In August 1939, the Nazi-Soviet Pact was signed. The pact declared that Germany and Russia would not go to war with each other. It also had a hidden clause that gave Russia half of Poland, plus a free hand in taking over Finland and the Baltic states. Confident that he would not be facing serious opposition, Hitler began massing his armies along the Polish border towards the end of August. The Poles were also preparing for war, but they knew that their armies couldn't hold back the Germans, not without British or French support. Realizing that war was imminent, the British government initiated the evacuation scheme, which they had been planning for the past few months. The purpose of evacuation was to remove civilians from areas that were likely to be bombed in wartime. In the few days before war started, around 1.5 million people were evacuated out of major cities and into more rural areas. On the same day that the evacuation began, Hitler launched his invasion of Poland. 2 days later, on the 3rd of September, Chamberlain broadcast the following message to the British people.
I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
We sat next to the radio and we heard the declaration of the war, and my father and mother were quite upset. They'd both been injured in the First World War, and both my brother and I were getting to the right age of having to take part in the Second World War.
Were you surprised when you heard war had been declared?
No, because I was only 16, 17, and it was just one of those things.
Were you surprised when you heard war had started?
Well, being in the army, yes, we was hearing rumours. Yeah.
Not really, because I was used to conflict in Belfast.
Surprised when the war started? No, because it was kind of budding, wasn't it? Hitler was going too far. I don't know whether I'm surprised that Britain eventually going to war against him or something like that, but he had to be stopped, and of course Britain entered the war, and so there was no surprise about it really.
Do you think Britain was right to get involved in the war?
Oh yes. The threat to Europe was so great, because knocking people off piece by piece, and we would have been next, in spite of what he said.
Yes.
But what was Britain going to fight the war with? Their navy was the largest in the world, but their army was small when compared to its continental counterparts. The British Empire would need a proper army if it was to stand any hope of victory.